So we speak to Daniel Safran. What is it about the race for the next United Nations Secretary General? It's entered a new exciting phase following Uganda's surprise nomination of veteran diplomat and former UN Under-Secretary-General Olara Otunnu. The late entry comes as the Security Council prepares to begin informal straw polls, adding fresh momentum and uncertainty to an already closely watched contest. Otunnu joins former Senegalese President Macky Sall as Africa's second candidate, raising important questions about whether the continent's vote will be strengthened or divided. His nomination also highlights the complex geopolitical calculations that will shape the choice of the world's top diplomat, from regional alliances to the influence of the UN Security Council's permanent members. And to help us unpack the latest developments, we are joined now by former United Nations official and international affairs analyst Daniel Safran. Daniel, very good morning. Good to talk to you again. So, this is a surprise twist for some who are looking, but others might say, well, not necessarily. If you look at, for instance, Africa's behavior around very important and strategic positions such as this, there often is a split, and sometimes it goes along ideological lines or just simply between Anglophone and Francophone Africa. What are your thoughts about what's happening with this particular one?
I think there's possibility that that the Under-Secretary General Otunnu and perhaps Kampala noticed that there's no clear front runner in the race right now, and that presented an opportunity for them to try and seize. The timing, as you noted, is quite significant. Most candidates entered the race months ago. There was a town hall with all candidates last week, and the first straw polls are on Thursday. So it's not a typical moment to enter the race. But he broke no rules by doing so, and there's no deadline, and more candidates could still join. Regarding your point on the African vote. There too, perhaps the Undersecretary General noticed an opportunity because Macky Sall, who entered a while ago, does not have yet full African backing, and he failed to get the African Union's endorsement. And we don't really know how the three African members of the Council, DRC, Somalia, and Liberia, would vote on him. So perhaps Otunnu could pick up some support that was never really there for Sall. We don't really know. So each candidate is positioning to try and seize the moment. I just add that Latin America also has several candidates, and their own disunity could cost them too. So perhaps just maybe less so because their claim for the job this round is more widely recognized than Africa's.
So, as you mentioned, that the thinking might have been there is no clear front runner. Would that then suggest that Macky Sall is not imbuing a sense of strength, of confidence for Africa to say this is the right candidate, or Uganda believes that it's basically fielding a better one by putting Olara Otunnu as a credible contender for Secretary General position?
Um, I think first and foremost, this round is widely considered kind of the opportunity or the turn of Latin America. This is not written in stone. So it still could be Africa, but the general tendency is to consider it Latin America's turn, and also there is a lot of momentum and support for a woman to be Secretary General. There's never been a woman on the job in the 80 years of the United Nations. So I think for any male, it's a bit more challenging this time, and particularly from Africa, given kind of the Latin American turn. And we are at a very early stage of the race, though. So many dynamics can play out in the coming weeks and months. as the straw poll continue, and so each one is trying to seize the opportunity and the disunity of other regions and other parts. I think in that sense, Otunnu and Macky Sall are appealing to different aspects and different parts of the continent, and we'll see how that plays out. Otunnu is a very qualified person with a very strong background. Um, um, in the United Nations as a permanent representative, as Under-Secretary-General, foreign minister of his country. So that definitely helps his case.
That are raised in the outro and also with my first question of whether or not having two candidates would split the African vote, or whether or not this is the wrong question, because there are those who argue, and I think the conversation you and I have had as well, is that basically whoever becomes a Secretary General pretty much serves at the favor of the five veto holding members. So is it the candidate that can best not threaten those five members?
So I think there are two dimensions to this. The permanent members of the Council, Russia, China, the US, France, and the UK, are critical. You cannot face a veto by any of them if you want to get the job. At the same time, you also need the elected 10 to support you. You need their momentum, especially at the early stages of the race. We will see on Thursday as the first straw poll unfolds. By the way, this process is supposed to be secret, but typically the results are leaked quite quickly to the press. So everybody will be following this very closely, and the initial momentum will be important in shaping the race and making it clear who the front runners are. You could it's a bit like a restaurant. The elected members define what's on the menu, and then the permanent members select from that choice. So that's the way to look at it. And the fact that Africa does present two quite different candidates is not necessarily a bad thing at this stage. But at a later stage in the race, say in a scenario where no Latin American candidate becomes a clear frontrunner, then African unity will be much more important behind one candidate, because it's also not considered Africa's turn. It's more important even than amongst the Latin American candidates.
Then let's look at the short straw process where we are and the performance of those who've put their hand up. What has been your impressions? And also, if you could just share with us how Africa ought to be viewing this, because they obviously see the Security Council as a much stronger hallmark of influence of power. Why would it be different? Would they see it differently from how we would see an AU contest, for instance, and candidate?
Yeah. So this is really, I like to compare it a bit to the conclave when the Vatican chooses the Pope. This is really the UN choosing the world's secular Pope. So this is really global politics at play at the highest level. It's not within the family, so to speak, when it's the African Union or when it's any other regional organization. Other considerations have to be taken into account, and in this case, for example, as I mentioned, sorry for repeating myself, but the wider consensus is that it is Latin America's turn, so to speak. Again, this rule has been broken in the past. It could happen this time as well, but that's something to take into account. And right now, we have a field of 7 candidates. and Grossi from Argentina, Greenspan from Costa Rica, and Rodriguez Birket from Guyana appear to be the front runners. But none of that is locked in. So that's, I think, the reason that other potential candidates are looking for opportunities. And while at this stage African unity is not critical because each candidate is trying to find their way in. At a later stage, if we see that one of the African candidates is amongst the frontrunners, that's when African unity will be really critical. The example of 1991 is telling when Boutros Ghali was elected for Secretary General, and the initial African consensus was that it was Africa's turn at the time. So the African Union was determined to ensure that the continent gets the job. But there were several African candidates, and only at the very end did the African vote coalesce around Boutros Ghali when they realized that they had to support one candidate. That came only at the very end of the race, and indeed he got the job.
And I want to also look at that, and again, looking at those who are vying for the job now, as you mentioned, that the Ugandan candidate is regarded as somebody who has a very strong background, particularly of understanding the system. Otunnu's chances and influence being, characterized in that manner. But there is that unofficial rotational principle. So, would the chances of the candidates be weighed in by that? And I know you've just spoken about that, but we are increasingly speaking about a multipolar world. So, would words like that influence whether or not that rotational principle is honored, or would the emphasis be more on that? Who is going to bring about that representativity even further in the system?
I think I think ultimately a lot depends on geopolitics, and while Otunnu is a very qualified person with a strong reputation, a lot depends on global politics and on regional politics. So that's it's kind of, you can compare it a bit to three-dimensional chess game. There's so many factors at play here. As we said, there's whether it's Latin America or whether it's Africa, and then in Africa we have other dynamics, both with the African members of the council. So in this case, for example, Uganda's relations with at the global level with Beijing and Moscow have improved lately, but they're also a bit soured with Washington. So are we sure that the US will not veto Otunnu, not because of the person, but perhaps of the broader geopolitics? We'll have to wait and see on that. And on the regional level, Uganda's relations with the DRC are also complex, and not so close with Somalia and Liberia either. So that's an important factor, because these three countries are elected members of the council, and their votes, especially in the beginning, will be very important for the initial momentum of the candidates. At the same time, and as I mentioned earlier, Macky Sall's opening position is not necessarily better. Senegal's relations with these countries also is not very deep. He was not endorsed by the African Union. His own country endorsed his candidacy only, I think, 10 days ago or so. So the whole situation is quite challenging for everybody. But things can play out in surprising ways, and we'll have to wait and see how the process evolves.
And there has been a quote unquote greater democratization within the last 10 years of choosing a UN Secretary General. How is that going to play out? Is it going to be a cosmetic affair? Because ultimately, as you mentioned, that nobody gets to that position without facing the veto of the P5. And I want to, you've already pointed to history. Has anything happened in the past 10 years that we can say fundamentally changes what has occurred in history before?
So, yes, so I think, especially at the time when the council is more polarized, which is now the case, I think that's when the politics and the geopolitics is even more important. And also the need to find a common denominator for any candidate, and ultimately close a deal, mostly probably behind closed doors. So I think on the one hand, we do have this increased pressure and momentum to shed more light on the process, to have more transparency, but also there is a good chance that the most important decisions will be taken behind the scenes. This doesn't mean that the efforts to make the process more transparent are not important. Last week, on Thursday, I mentioned that earlier, there was a town hall with all the candidates. There were other opportunities for civil society to engage with the candidates. Um, this is altogether a good thing. We can get to learn about them and test them a little bit. But the problem is that, as we can see with Otunnu, a candidate can join at any stage. So, so to speak, skip these public hearings. And also, I think candidates know that they need to be very cautious, because in the end, the people who elect them are not the audience of these public hearings, but the P5 and the elected 10 members. But if you perform well, it does add momentum, it does add legitimacy. Um, Antonio Guterres, the current Secretary General, was elected 10 years ago, and his people in a detailed interview 10 years ago mentioned his own public hearings as an important opportunity for him to consolidate his candidacy and show his strengths. And just recently, last week, in the town hall, there was a poll amongst the audience of the town hall in the end, and Ambassador Birket from Guyana did fared very well. She got a very good result. Will that change the outcome of the race? I doubt it. But does it give her a little bit of momentum? Probably yes. So it's a mixed bag. But you mentioned the cosmetics earlier. Sometimes cosmetics is also important in making a process a bit better. This is gradual. International politics is very complicated. So the only way to advance is by one small step after the other.
And speaking of which, I mean, you've also written about how people overestimate the influence of the P5 and underestimate the calculations of the E10. So tell us about those elected members of the Security Council and the role that they play, while you also just take us through what then is going to happen over the next couple of weeks.
Yes, so I think the veto of the permanent five is very important. But sometimes we focus only on that, and it's not a wrong thing to pay attention to it. But the veto ultimately kicks in at a later stage. In the beginning of the process, the question whether a candidate can be a front runner or not is determined by the whole council. But ultimately, the bulk of the vote comes from the E10. So, say you're a very good candidate, but somehow, because of various reasons, the elected 10 members don't really support you in the beginning of the process, then your candidacy won't even reach the stage of being tested by by the veto of the P5. So as I mentioned, this kind of situation of the E10 defining what's on the menu and the P5 selecting their main course, so to speak. And in the coming weeks, what we will see is every 3 to 4 weeks we will see a straw poll, which is an informal process. It's supposed to be secret, but most of the times it's leaked to the press. Initially, all the straw polls are the same color, so there is no veto in the beginning. It's just to test who are the front runners and let perhaps some um, candidates drop out, and potentially others join at a later stage. It's rare that candidates join after the first straw poll, but it does happen. Um, and we will see one this Thursday. We will see another one probably in mid to late August. Then in September there will be another one, and also the high-level week in New York, the famous week with all the speeches of the heads of state and government. So there will be a lot of happening in the coming weeks. Typically, a Secretary General is elected in mid-October, but that's not written in stone either. It's a miracle could happen, and it could happen faster, or it could take more time and end up taking place even later in the year. The current Secretary General's term ends on 31st December, so that's basically the deadline of the process.
David, thank you so much for your time, your thoughts. Daniel Safran-Khan, former United Nations official and international affairs analyst, just speaking to us about the latest. Olara Otunnu, who has just been thrown into the ring for the role of UNSG by Uganda. It's 8:30. Let's go back to Zwalani Tulo, Mwepe Tulo, for the latest news headlines.
SABC News.